Shana Tova. In my various rabbi groups, some of my colleagues have been joking that instead of sermons this year, rabbis ought to just stand up and cry publicly for a few minutes, or perhaps lean our heads out of the window and let out a big, primal scream. So many things have been hard about this year. There are the illnesses and the deaths associated with the COVID pandemic itself, staggering numbers. And there are also the many trickle-down effects: isolation from family members and friends, job losses, stunted plans to start college or travel, the toll on everyone's mental health. A few months ago, things were looking up. We could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And then the Delta variant came along and it made our day-to-day decision-making feel impossible again. I imagine that all of us can relate to the sheer exhaustion of this time. I think so much of that exhaustion stems from the fact that we are being forced to live with a degree of ambiguity and uncertainty that we as human beings just are not conditioned to tolerate very well. Perhaps you remember the feeling from school of preparing for a big test, studying and feeling anxious about it, and then experiencing an incredible flood of relief when it was finally over, even if you did poorly. For many people, even an undesirable outcome, like a bad grade on a test, feels better than that period of uncertainty that comes before it with the test still looming. And yet this kind of uncertainty is precisely what we've been navigating for the past year and a half now. And I hate to say it out loud, but there's not a clear end in sight to this pandemic right now. A colleague of mine, Rabbi Shira Koch-Epstein, recently explained it this way. She writes, "I think this is why it's so very hard and exhausting to manage all of the technical details of the uncertainty of the moment, because the radical uncertainty doesn't seem temporary. The uncertainty of this pandemic time is hanging over another more fundamental uncertainty we are holding in a longer term way about climate change and the future of human life and our planet." Did you get that? The uncertainty of this pandemic time is hanging over another more fundamental uncertainty about climate change and the future of human life and our planet. Gulp. Anyway, this is exactly what I want to address today: why uncertainty is so hard for us, and what tools we have in our spiritual toolbox that can help us make it through these uncertain times. So first, let's start with why it's so hard. For some insight, I turned to the field of psychology, and Kavanagh partner and psychology professor Dan Rosen directed me towards the work of a psychologist named Kelly Wilson. Wilson writes, "Humans don't just suffer when things are bad, they also suffer when things might be bad. In the experimental literature, it is readily shown that organisms prefer environments in which painful things are predictable over environments where they're not." Wilson also turns to evolutionary biology to explain the connection between ambiguity and suffering. He invites his reader to imagine that we are early hominids out on the savannah, and off in the distance on the horizon, we see a vague shape. He goes on to describe how the shape could be a blueberry bush on the one hand, or a bear on the other. If it's a blueberry bush, then there's no danger at all. In fact, it's great to approach it. But if it's a bear, then it's a threat, and that early human had better get back into the cave quickly. Our ancestors, Kelly writes, the ones who survived and passed on the genetic material of which we are all made, were selected for their caution. This means that ambiguity itself will often be experienced as aversive. Clinically, ambiguity is often a constant source of considerable suffering. Clinically, ambiguity is often a constant source of considerable suffering. During these ambiguous times, so many people are indeed suffering. In The Atlantic, science writer Robin Marantz-Hennig recently published an article entitled, "We're All Second Guessing Ourselves Now." It's about the challenge of grandparenting through the Delta variant. She writes, and I quote, "So I'm helplessly left watching as my daughter and son-in-law negotiate the scary path ahead for their two daughters, ages 6 and 3. That is hard for someone like me, who's always been uncomfortable with the gray areas of life. Delta presents us with a moment of true uncertainty when decision-making is new terrain for all of us." And she concludes, "Maybe our accumulated wisdom is most valuable now, not in providing all the answers, but in demonstrating how to do the best we can in the face of vulnerability." So we've established that human beings, all of us, are conditioned to experience ambiguity as suffering. And yet, right now, from the time we wake up in the morning until we go to sleep at night, we are forced to navigate radical uncertainty with every plan we try to make. What are we to do? What tools do we possess that can help us as we enter into this new year, a year of uncertainty? As Jews, we know a thing or two about living with uncertainty. These may not even be the most uncertain times that our people have lived through by a long shot. And on Rosh Hashanah in particular, we lean into that uncertainty, beginning with our history. One way of understanding the Torah readings for these days of Rosh Hashanah is that they focus in on the question of continuity with regard to Abraham. From the very beginning of Abraham's story, God has repeatedly promised him offspring, saying, "You will be a great nation. You will be as hard to count as the dust of the earth. You will be as numerous as the stars in the sky." But Abraham's biggest anxiety is that this promise will not come to pass. In chapter 15 of Bereshit, he cries out, "O Lord God, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless, with only my servant Dameshek Eliezer in charge of my household?" God reassures Abraham, "None but your very own issue shall be your heir." But there are continued challenges. First, fertility issues, and then, even once Abraham does have offspring, family dynamics that call continuity of his line into question. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we read of the expulsion of Abraham's first son, Ishmael, and his mother Hagar by Sarah, and just how close Ishmael comes to dying in the wilderness. It's almost the end of Abraham's line. On the second day, we read the story of the Akedah, during which Abraham himself nearly kills his own son, Isaac. The future of Abraham's progeny, that continuity about which he has felt so desperate, is totally called into question. Year in and year out, as we read these stories on Rosh Hashanah, we are invited into Abraham's anxiety over this precarious situation. Will there be continuity? Will we have a future? It's also hard to think about uncertainty in Jewish terms without noting that a good 70% of the Torah, and I'm talking here about the middle of Exodus all the way through the end of Deuteronomy, takes place in the wilderness, the Midbar. Important things happen in the wilderness. That's where the Torah is given, not in spite of, but precisely because of the openness that it represents. The wilderness is uncomfortable terrain, and yet it offers potential for growth. The Midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah teaches, if you desire change, if you hope for anything new to come from within, you must first open yourself up like the wilderness, the Midbar. So the Midbar is the place where possibility arises. Uncertainty itself is the place where possibility arises. The wilderness also comes up in Jeremiah 31, the Haftorah we read on Rosh Hashanah Day 2. Ko amar Adonai matzachen bamidbar. Am sride charev haloch lehargio Yisrael. Thus said the Lord, the people escaped from the sword when Israel was marching homeward, found favor in the wilderness. Matzachen bamidbar. That's a beautiful prayer for us in this year too, that in this wilderness, this place of uncertainty where we currently find ourselves residing, we might also experience chen, favor. Our rabbinic tradition as well has an awful lot of things to say about living with ambiguity. There's one teaching in the Talmud in particular that explores 7 matters that are concealed from human beings, that are defined as being utterly unknowable by us. The Talmud says, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, Shiv'a dvarim mechusim mibnei adam, 7 matters are concealed from people, Eluhain, and they are Yom HaMitah, the day of death, Yom HaNechama, the day of consolation, Ve'omek Hadin, and the depth of justice, Ve'ein Adam Yodea ma belibo shel chavero, and a person cannot know what is in the heart of another, Ve'ein Adam Yodea b'meh mistaker, and a person cannot know in what way they will earn a profit, Umalchut Beit David matai tachzor, or when the monarchy of the house of David will be restored, Umalchut chayevet matai tichleh, and when the wicked monarchy will cease to exist. None of us can know certain things. None of us knows what's in the heart of another. None of us knows the day of our death. By claiming that all of these things are fundamentally hidden from our human ability to know, the Gemara is emphasizing that truly we are always living with a high degree of fundamental uncertainty. Uncertainty is so uncomfortable for us, though, and it causes us so much suffering that most of the time we go to great lengths to mask it. In a typical year, therefore, one of the important functions of these high holidays is that they remind us of this fundamental truth that life is, in fact, uncertain. But this year, I don't feel like we need the high holidays to drive home the point at all, because we are living it. We are living the uncertainty of this pandemic. We are living in the wilderness with a sense of impending doom about the fate of our planet. We are living it day in and day out. So another way to think about the function of these holidays, and really perhaps the whole of our rabbinic tradition, our religious tradition, is that Judaism exists precisely to help us navigate the uncertainty that is life. And this Rosh Hashanah, we ask, how best can we do that? So a few ideas. First, whether you already have one or not, this is the time to ground yourself in a spiritual practice. Some kind of daily practice, a regular rhythm, something to remind us of the fundamentals of life and to help us hold it all. Any spiritual practice has the potential to offer us structure, community, a wider context, moral grounding, and ultimately coping skills. Krista Tippett, the host of the podcast On Being, recently interviewed Sharon Salzberg, a teacher of Buddhism and meditation, who talks about equanimity as the huge capacity of our hearts to hold it all, darkness and light, love and pain. In the episode entitled The Healing is in the Return, Tippett wrote down some of Salzberg's words and then read them back to her almost like a poem. And it's so beautiful. Here it is. I tried to do the best I can. I try to learn from my mistakes, and the world is the world of constant change and pleasure and pain, and being thanked and not being thanked, all of those things. And so that's where equanimity comes in, as a kind of comprehension of this is the way things are. And of course, this impulse of trying to hold it all is also there in Judaism. In the words, again, of my colleague, Rabbi Shira Koch-Epstein, this is absolutely one of the messages that the Torah has for us. Quote, that our tradition knows that there is always both radical uncertainty and the ability for faith, divine love, belonging, wisdom, and human initiative to help us manage through it. Taking these high holidays seriously, giving yourself the space to reflect and to be present now through Yom Kippur, and then not stopping there, but taking that practice with you into the year in whatever ways you want. This is a way of cultivating equanimity, the capacity of the heart to hold it all. Spiritual practice is a powerful tool for moving through uncertainty. Second, this time of year, we are reminded of the importance of compassion, patience, and forgiveness. These are godly qualities, and as we repeat them over and over and over again in our liturgy, we aim to imitate the divine and to employ them, not only towards others, although certainly that, but also and most especially towards ourselves. The Austrian poet Rilke puts this so beautifully, writing, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek the answers which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." May this be a year in which we nurture our own capacity for patience and self-compassion. And third, one more spiritual tool that we have at our disposal is that this year we are entering into a Shemitah year. Shemitah is a radical Jewish concept, a biblical commandment to imagine a better life. In Leviticus, the Torah instructs the Israelites to observe a sabbatical every 7 years so that the land, the workers, and the social and economic system all get to rest and reset. This year, as we enter on the Hebrew calendar, the year 5782, that number is divisible by 7, you can check it, which means that beginning today, we are once again in the 7th year of the cycle. Shemitah year is a year of radical release. And that word Shemitah literally means release. So every 7 years, the earth has a sabbatical. It's released from needing to produce. Every 7 years, all debts are forgiven. Everybody is released from those obligations and gets a fresh start. As our world this year still grapples with this deadly pandemic, and as we hang over the abyss of climate change, this Shemitah year provides us with an opportunity for reimagining all sorts of things, our lives and gaps of prosperity, strengthening our accountability, and spurring a lifelong commitment to protecting our shared earth. For this Shemitah year, Kavanah will be partnering with Shemitah Project Northwest for some local Seattle-based programming, beginning with a Shemitah festival during Sukkot at the end of this month. We're also part of the Jewish Emergent Network, which in partnership with Chazon, Reboot, and the Israeli Shemitah Project is creating a year of compelling conversations, offering ways to take Shemitah to the next level and make it more meaningful and helpful to us all. Over the course of the coming year, with these partners, we will focus on a number of themes. In the fall, we'll focus on better balance between work and home, body and soul. In the winter, we'll be exploring racial justice, Indigenous land rights, and the demand for better equity and equality. In the spring, we will return to the Holy Land, learning with our partners in Israel about new ways to mark Shemitah, to honor the sanctity of the land and the lives of all the people who call it home. And then in the summer, we will focus on the big picture of our current climate crisis, how we can do more to decenter human supremacy and be better at taking care of Mother Earth for the sake of all living beings and future generations. When we experience ambiguity as suffering, our human response is to try to control everything we can, by instead pushing ourselves to release on all of these levels over the course of 12 whole months. This Shemitah year may be the best and most comprehensive tool yet for helping us make our way through these uncertain times. So I want to return to psychologist Kelly Wilson. He suggests a couple of experiments that we can run ourselves, and I encourage you to actually try them. The first one he calls to eat or not to eat. So Kelly suggests that you do this. You prepare a meal, you sit down at the table, you put food on your plate, you pick up a bite of food with a knife and fork. And now, he invites, raise it toward your mouth and stop at the cusp, right between eating and not eating. Linger right there at the cusp. Find that place right at the tipping point between eating and not eating. Your mind won't like this. And then he says, choose to not know whether you will eat the meal or not. In the end, ultimately, you either will or you won't eat. But meanwhile, the purpose of the exercise is to try to expand that moment of discomfort, that moment of ambiguity, and to notice how intolerant your mind is of the unknown. The other experiment that he suggests is to consider a question with fairly high stakes, while intentionally not deciding one way or the other what you want to do about it. Rather than conclude or decide, which is precisely what we as human beings are so hardwired to do, he says to let yourself wonder what you will do. And I think that's such a great kavanah, intention, for our high holiday prayer this year in particular, to see if you can sit in the ambiguity of not knowing about what's coming next and not deciding, and see what you can discern from that place of uncertainty. Minds, Kelly says, don't like the places in between. We don't like these places that we don't know, but it is in precisely these foreign places that possibility lives. The Midbar. On the high holidays, this year as always, we acknowledge the radical uncertainty of the moment, the radical uncertainty of the world around us. Sitting in this uncertainty is so uncomfortable, and yet being able to name it is important, and that itself may help alleviate the suffering associated with this ambiguity, that wearying quality that it has. This Rosh Hashanah, we ground ourselves in the gifts of time, of community, of ever-present love and compassion, of expansiveness. We remind ourselves that although we are indeed living with a high degree of ambiguity and uncertainty, we also possess the tools that we need not to experience this as suffering. We have the capacity, we have it within us, and we have it from within our Jewish tradition, to hold ambiguity with equanimity, to cultivate patience in ourselves, and to use the concept of Shemitah to spend a year intentionally focusing on release. Or if all else fails, maybe we should just set a time to open our windows together and let out a giant primal scream. May 5782 be a year of sweetness and blessing for you. Ko amar Adonai matzachen bamidbar. May we, like our ancient ancestors, find favor in the wilderness. Shana Tova.